A few months ago, the Russian army released a pop song fantasizing about its nukes wiping out the US. The music video features beautiful B-roll of a nuclear missile nicknamed the Son of Satan, with lyrics like, "It'll scatter our enemies to dust in an instant, it's ready to carry out the sentence." The US's air defense is no hindrance to it, it's not scared of sanctions. When the beat dropped and the missile launched, I'm not gonna lie, I felt something, and I thought to myself, that's pretty cool. And that is the intention of this music. Therefore, it is propaganda. Propaganda, as Oxford defines it, is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. In this instance, the Russian army is glorifying their country, its power, and the war while trying to make their citizens more patriotic. So it got me wondering, how else is music used as propaganda? Who else has used it in this way, and when did it begin? Well, to understand the history of musical propaganda, we have to go back about 2.5 millennia. The earliest musical propaganda that we know of is by a Greek man named Tytaeus. It's believed he was alive during mid-7th century BC, and he wrote poems during a difficult time for the Greeks. There was a period of civic unrest, so in a poem called eunomia, which means law and order, he urged citizens to respect the king, council, and elders of Greece. This is a theme that we'll see in musical propaganda for thousands of years to come. Tytaeus also wrote poems during the Second Messenian War, which was a war between the Greek states of Messenia and Sparta. Apparently, he was some sort of state poet, and he wrote poems encouraging the Spartans to fight till the very end for their city. His poems were so powerful that even hundreds of years later, Spartan armies were forced to listen to them. The only book that has record of Tytaeus is in the Suda, and in the Suda it is said that he wrote martial music, which is a type of music intended for the military, so it's likely that his music was used for chants, marches, and other militaristic rituals. Another early example of musical propaganda is during the Augustan period in Rome, when a couple of poems were written about how great Caesar Augustus was. One poem was entitled Aeneid by a poet named Virgil. It was a story about Rome and its ancestors that accidentally became one of the biggest pieces of Roman propaganda. In the poem, Virgil says, "Time and again you've heard his coming, promised Caesar Augustus, son of a god, he will bring back the age of gold." This is another recurring theme in musical propaganda, and it's that the authors praise the person that they're talking about. Historians say that Virgil wasn't even a die-hard Augustus fan, nor do they think he was employed by Augustus to write this. Instead, it was a nod to him because he did bring peace to the Roman Empire. Like I said, it accidentally became a piece of propaganda, which is how a lot of musical propaganda is. The author may not write with a certain political goal in mind, but the listener of that song may come away with some sort of political meaning. Regardless, this poem and many other pieces of propaganda helped inspire citizens and bring about the Pax Romana, which was roughly a 200-year period of peace in Rome, also known as a golden age. That just goes to show how powerful music can be as a tool of propaganda, because if you hear a poem saying, "This guy is the son of God and he's gonna bring the age of gold," you're probably gonna think he's a pretty cool guy and you're going to want to trust him. Regardless of whether or not you count poems as music, this use of poetry to spread ideas would be the seed that sprouted into musical propaganda. If we skip forward about half a century, we make our way to medieval propaganda. A perfect example of musical propaganda during the medieval times were the troubadours. The troubadours were poets and composers from southern France, and apparently they had a huge cultural influence. Two of the main topics troubadours covered were love and knighthood. However, these popular poets also wrote over 100 songs about the crusades, with many of them being in favor of the crusades. These songs were filled with motivation for soldiers to fight in the east, and they also summoned biblical figures to help motivate the troops. But unfortunately for them, Archangel Michael never showed up to the battlefield. One troubadour in particular, raimbaut de vaqueiras. I have no idea if I said that right. I apologize if I said that wrong. That's a tough name. He served under Pope Boniface I and also participated in the Fourth Crusade. He wrote many crusade songs with many calls to action. On the flip side, there were troubadours like Guillem figueira, who wrote the song Diun sirventes far, which was a critique of the Catholic Church in the Crusades. Some of these songs were just poems and some of them came with music, and the one I just mentioned you can actually listen to on Spotify. Troubadours also praised kings and wealthy people in their music. For example, one composer wrote about Duke of Austria Leopold V after he returned from a crusade, when he said, "Leopold, my lord and king, has made Austria great once more. He went to the Holy Land and fought for the Lord." These musicians also made songs for their patrons that glorified their rulers and celebrated their power and wealth. Songs like these helped to reinforce the social hierarchy of the time, shaping the opinion of the public. The most interesting part about all of this musical propaganda is that these musicians may not have known that they were influencing society in the way that they were, but music can influence the mind much more than you think. And if we fast forward about 700 years, that brings us to the modern age, where musical propaganda is much more abundant thanks to technology.
Yes, I love technology, but not as much as you see.
Nowadays, there are many different ways in which propaganda can be delivered, with the most effective ones obviously being the news and the media. However, musical propaganda is more common nowadays than it ever has been before. So let's start with taking a look at musical propaganda from the good old United States. If we go back to the American Revolution, songs and poems were a very common form of propaganda to get people all riled up and patriotic. One poem highlighted an embarrassing retreat by the British as Americans shot them in the back while they were retreating. The lyrics read, "How brave you went out with muskets all bright, and thought to be frightened the folks with the sight. But when you got there, how they powdered your pums, and all the way home how they peppered your bums. And is it not, honies, a comical farce, to be proud in the face and to be shot in the arse?" Songs like this brought Americans together to laugh at the British and inspire patriotism. The song Yankee Doodle was originally created by the British to make fun of the Americans, as doodle meant fool and macaroni was a popular style of dressing in Italy and England. So essentially the song was meant to call Americans dirty dummies, but when the Americans won the war, it was used to embarrass the British as they lost to those so-called dirty dummies. During World War II, Americans became much more united after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many songs were made calling for Americans to come together and fight. And if you couldn't fight, there were many other ways you can contribute, like buying war bonds. Here's an example.
This is your war, this is my war, this is our war, and we've got to win.
Songs like these were very common, and there were some popular ones too, like Praise God and Pass the Ammunition. There were also much more offensive songs used to dehumanize the enemy.
You're a sap, Mr. Jap, to make a Yankee cranky. You're a sap, Mr. Jap, Uncle Sam is gonna spank you.
Honestly, I was pretty surprised to find out Dr. Seuss was the one who drew that political cartoon. However, it's not too hard to see how these happy-go-lucky songs about defeating the enemy after they had just attacked Pearl Harbor were able to bring Americans together and unify them. The US government saw the power of this music, so they even commissioned its use in propaganda films. They also had a music program in the army that recruited musicians for a variety of different tasks to help use music as a psychological weapon to win the war. One of the creators of this program, Major Howard Bronson, said, "The employment of music by the German army has received considerable publicity as part of its daily routine. Thus, if mass singing works for the Germans, maybe it might also benefit the American army." During the Cold War, the US government actually sponsored a lot of concerts, tours, and festivals. They would have jazz artists, rock artists, and artists from other genres perform around the world to help spread American ideology. The reason this worked is because, like I'll touch on later, a lot of communist countries didn't have the freedoms to listen to or make whatever types of music they wanted. So if they heard a rock band singing about something that they weren't allowed to sing about, it may inspire them to turn their back on communism. The US also had a state-owned radio station called The Voice of America that tried to use its influence to fight against communism. Ain't I Right is probably one of the most popular songs from this era and had a very strong anti-communist message.
Now ain't I right? Ain't I right? Ain't I right? It matters not to you how people suffer.
Nowadays, there isn't too much anti-any one country propaganda in the US, at least in terms of music, but most musical propaganda is internal. So for example, songs with left-wing meanings or right-wing meanings could be considered musical propaganda. Think about God Bless the USA by Lee Greenwood versus This Is America by Childish Gambino. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And now we arrive at my favorite form of musical propaganda, and that is communist propaganda. This musical propaganda is extremely obvious and often forced by the dictators. However, when you're raised in a country with all this propaganda around you, the music perfectly complements that. And the leaders of these countries know how powerful that music can be. When Hitler was trying to gain more power and influence, he created the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The head of this ministry said, "Music affects the heart and emotions more than the intellect. Where then could the heart of a nation beat stronger than in the huge masses, in which the heart of a nation has found its true home?" Mao Zedong, the former chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, said, "In music you may apply appropriate foreign principles and use foreign musical instruments, but still there must be national characteristics. The arts are inseparable from the customs, feelings, and even the language of the people, from the history of the nation." So clearly these powerful leaders understood the importance of music and used musical propaganda to their advantage. And so did the following countries I'm going to cover. For a long time in the Soviet Union, there was a variety of different legislation that controlled the creative output of artists. If you spoke out against the government, that was obviously an issue, so the only options were were to speak well of the government or not speak about it at all. Russia also has the military band service of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, quite the mouthful, which is essentially a collection of all of the Russian military bands, which is a great outlet for more propaganda. After the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, the rules on music loosened up a bit. However, Russia still has tons of artists making musical propaganda. A lot of artists are believed to be paid by the Russian government to make this propaganda music. Russia even has an arts fund that goes toward supporting cultural projects connected with Russian cultural identity, which basically translates to supporting art that makes us look good.
Because these are people that I listened to when I was a kid. Like when my grandparents would play their favorite music, these people would be the people that would play. And I like their music. Because I was a kid, you know, whatever, I didn't know better. And I see these motherfuckers pushing this shit. These absolute sellouts who have no soul, who have nothing, who have no integrity. I just cannot believe how low Russian artists will go for money.
This guy made a very good video on Russian propaganda music, so I'll link it in the description. And he even talked about artists that used to be anti-war but were likely paid by the Russian government and then all of a sudden became pro-war. So yeah, I'll link it in the description below. Nowadays, if you speak out against the Russian government or against the war, it's extremely easy for them to cancel you. As a matter of fact, there have been many musicians who have said something that the government doesn't like that will get them canceled. Musicians have been arrested, forced to flee the country, had shows and tours canceled, and they have even blacklisted over 29 bands from performing at venues. So like I said, it's extremely easy for the Russian government to cancel artists they don't like. And when they do this, they're only allowing for one ideology. Instead, the Russian government promotes songs like the one about nukes I mentioned in the beginning of the video, which was released by Park Patriot Media, a propaganda arm of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Ironically enough, the singer of this song, Denis Maidanov, is also a politician, and for some reason some people eat this stuff up.
This song is for the ages. I don't think it is. It's just from forgettable propaganda garbage. I'm 61 years old. I've seen so much in my life. I've barely missed death so many times in my life, but I'm still crying. Yaroslav, you're a genius. For managing to pass the voice of gods in the song to us. What is this? It's like, either this is a bot or this is like a religious cult at this point.
North Korea is similar to Russia, except they are full-on communists. This means they have absolute control over what the citizens can and can't listen to, so pretty much all of what they listen to is propaganda. As Stanford Library says, North Korean music, much like music of the former Soviet Union, has been carefully propagated to serve the party. They use their music to promote their ideas, glorify their leaders, and encourage national loyalty. The North Korean government has state-sanctioned performers like the Mansudae art troupe or the Moranbong band that produce and perform their propaganda music.
Analysts say most, if not all, musicians in North Korea are military members. As North Korean soldiers, they are literally defending the regime through propaganda music.
So unfortunately, it's unlikely that Kim Jong-un actually listens to Sister Nancy, as the interview would suggest. And unlike Russia, where the people are becoming much more free to make the type of music they would like, North Korea is extremely strict. To demonstrate how hardcore North Korean propaganda is, let me tell you a story about potato pride. In the mid-1990s, there was a huge famine in North Korea which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and a crop that would grow the best to solve this issue was potatoes, due to North Korea's terrain. However, citizens preferred other foods, particularly rice, but the government had to grow potatoes, so they attempted to incentivize the citizens into eating potatoes with propaganda. They promoted potatoes in TV, movies, art, and of course, music. And the best example of this is a song called Potato Pride, which is just an absolutely hilarious song singing about how great potatoes are.
감자 찰떡 꿀 마시자 할머니들 괜찮은데 아이들은 랑날라 감자엿이 제일이네.
With lyrics like, "In the past, people lived poorly in this far-flung region, which today, under the arms of the party, has become a paradise on earth. Mid-famine, may I remind you." This may be the most clear-cut example of musical propaganda. So it's fascinating how throughout history, music has been used to influence people and bring them together, whether it's for better or for worse. There's a lot more musical propaganda out there. I mean, technically, anything could be considered propaganda, but regardless, I don't have time to talk about all of it in this video. So if there's one thing to be learned from this video, maybe take into consideration how the music you're listening to affects your mind, your thoughts, and your actions. Anyways, thank you all for watching. This has been Matty Balls. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.